Hey guys, Grimdoc here. Just a bit of a disclaimer before we start this big video. I need to go into detail that this is not taking a direct place on the timeline. And this episode, as you can clearly see from the details, is way longer than you're probably used to, so just a heads up. In this special episode, I'll be going over everything that you guys need to learn and know about the 9 hells of Dungeons & Dragons in the Forgotten Realms universe. So if you're not comfortable with branching off of the timeline, I'd suggest checking out the next episode or the previous ones to get back into the main chronology of the D&D multiverse. But I do need to iterate here, guys, that this video won't be covering everything, just a basic gist of the 9 hells. So please understand, my dudes, that the lore of the 9 hells stretches deeper than ever. So we're going to keep the story short as we move through each individual layer after we describe the biggest parts. This means that, yeah guys, I'll definitely cover more lore on this place in the future during this 100 video series. And yeah, over 100 videos is a lot, but it's not even close to what ambition I have for this channel. Regardless of all that, this will be the longest video I've ever made as of right now, so without further ado, let's dive deep into the realms of hell. So we gotta start from the top. All of this starts at the Outer Realms, outside of realm space. So in episode 1, I covered how there are crystal spheres that basically embody each universe. Well, Dungeons & Dragons in particular has different editions, and the crystal spheres concept of how the outer universes work was removed. While some have said that these things are more so like a silvery mist that transitions the edge of a wild space system into the astral sea, others state that the remnants of them can be seen far away in the edges of space itself. In the grand scheme of things, I think the original intentions of the Crystal Sphere system was put into place during the 2nd edition to let people cross between Orth, Kryn, and Toril, and the other multiverse of other D&D worlds and stories. Remember guys, everything in D&D is connected in some way, and even the stories you make up for D&D can be connected to the other worlds of the multiverse. So that made-up story that you played with the GM, yeah, in some way, that's technically connected to the Forgotten Realms too. Really cool stuff, right? Alrighty, so anyways guys, before we start here, I need to tell you that there's no origin story on how the Outer Realms began. So how all of that stuff came into existence or came to be is not known. Some people speculate that this is where Io the dragon god comes into play, or Asgarath as he's known, considering that Ao was responsible for the prime material plane, but at the end of the day, there's nothing canon that tells us where this stuff was made or came from. So there's like 3 different ways that we can describe how the realm or reality of the 9 hells start, by the way. Remember guys, this was before the Dawn War and during the Age of Black, before even Ao created the prime material plane. And I understand for a lot of people this entire thing can get confusing. So let's just think of it like real life for a second. You're on Earth. Earth is floating in space. And space would be floating in the sphere of our universe, or our reality. As you eventually go further and further and further through the unimaginable space of our universe, you might end up in another reality eventually, crossing some kind of barrier or end of the universe. Originally, that barrier would have been the end of a crystal sphere. Now, as you guys know, crystal spheres were removed, but the one thing I have discovered after doing some very deep research is that the world axis cosmology doesn't seem to fit here specifically to where we are in the video timeline, because the model for this version of reality was created after the spell plague of 1385 DR, which we'll cover in a future episode, but for now we can sort of cling to the Io and Ao theory for the creation of all realities and the multiverse in Dungeons & Dragons. And the outer planes being outside of the material world are more connected to mortality, whereas the inner planes being connected to the material world and its inner workings. So instead of us using the world axis cosmology or the world tree cosmology, we will be using the Great Wheel cosmology as a reference instead for this video. Now, we gotta realize, guys, that this is fiction. Each dimension or plane of existence is basically another universe. And in Dungeons & Dragons, the amount of realities can go on infinitely. So with all of this out of the way, we need to ask the question, what are the 9 hells? Obviously, they're inspired from Dante Alighieri, from a book called The Divine Comedy, or La Divina Commedia, which was written around the 1300s. This is all based off of Dante's Inferno, which includes the 9 circles of hell, where each circle or layer of hell is an eternal punishment for the sins committed here on Earth, where at the very, very bottom has a demon eating the souls. And I'll go back to this later in the video, so keep that in your mind as a reference, my dudes. Anyways, guys, let's sit back and get started. From the top, Baator, the reversed mountain, the layer deep, the 9 hells. Before everything we know, there was Baator, guys, or Baator, depending on which way you properly pronounce it. But anyways, this place doesn't have an origin story yet in Dungeons & Dragons, and it might never, considering that it's an outer realm dimension. Now, Baator is the original name of the 9 hells in Dungeons & Dragons, but what I've discovered personally is there's tidbits and remnants of a species that existed before Baator was even called the 9 hells. Now, for a lot of you lore fanatics, you guys already know that Asmodeus literally fell into Baator and caused the 9 hells to become what it is currently in modern Dungeons & Dragons. He literally fell into it. He wasn't just banished there. I mean, he kinda might have been, but he literally fell there, dudes. And I'll describe all of that later on in this video. But before he fell, there was the ancient Baatorians that existed there. Now, before I jump into this rabbit hole, understand that there's mysteries that are completely incomplete or haven't been solved or revealed yet at all by the writers and creators of modern Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the original Baatorians had their own supposed society in Baator before Asmodeus fell, but we really don't know much about them at all. They're considered fiends, but personally, I have my own conspiracy theory that the Baatorians were the result of the Obyrith Lords before the Dawn War. Because in the 8th layer of the 9 hells, called Cania, there's shapes that were frozen in the ice. And some people have melted that ice and found frozen angels fighting spined creatures of an unknown origin. And this sort of solidifies my own conspiracy theory here because of the Dawn War being between the gods and the Obyrith Lords. And I believe that some of those spined creatures might have been Obyriths themselves or something similar, due to the fact that according to the official Wikipedia page of Dungeons & Dragons, the Obyriths were described to be not resemblant of any living being outside of some insectoids. But in the 3rd edition Manual of the Planes, it adds that there are alien-like abandoned cities frozen in the ice as well. Either way, that part is mere speculation, and there's no canon fact telling us that this is the case. Anyways, dudes, the Baatorians lived there before the 9 hells existed, and one of the only remaining types of Baatorians that we currently know of are called Nuparibos. Now, these things were first ever mentioned back in 1983 in the Monster Manual too, and it says that the origin of these specific beings were inspired by Japanese yokai from the 15th century here in real life, and they were called the Faceless Ghost, or the Noparibo. The Nuparibos are basically the embodiment of failure in the 9 hells, but we'll get back to them later on because we have a lot to cover here, guys. Okay, so there's still apparently ancient Baatorians that still exist in the 9 hells as well. Considering that there's tunnels and caves under Maladomini and Malbolge that even the devils refuse to go inside, believing that some sort of these ancient Baatorians still lurk within them. Now, one theory that's been floating around surrounds this elder evil called Zargon. Now, Zargon is considered an elder evil, which means there's no real timeline on how he came to be or started existing in modern D&D just yet. Now, there's more theories floating around the rabbit hole here, guys, that Zargon was the leader of Baator before Asmodeus fell from the heavens, and that during his time as the king of the Elder Days in ancient Baator, There was running slime and evil abound in this ancient forgotten era. And later on in one of the layers of hell, we'll describe how that matches up with how there's a bit of it in Stygia, where there's some bridges there that are caked in layers of frozen slime. Whatever the case, the stories surrounding this theory state that Asmodeus couldn't kill Zargon, so instead he ripped his horn and cast it into the prime material plane, where eventually he formed a new body around that horn. Honestly, dudes, I think having this story being canon would be absolutely fantastic, but unfortunately, we just don't know. So with the theories and rumors of what the Nine Hells were like before the fall of Asmodeus, let's start with the story surrounding his fall. Because in each edition of D&D, there's basically a different story on him, and nothing is set in stone yet though. So each one might even be a lie made up by Asmodeus himself, considering he's the Lord of Lies in the D&D multiverse. Regardless of how it happened, Asmodeus fell into Baator, to the very, very bottom of where the Serpent's Coil is. And we'll talk about it more once we go through each individual layer, by the way, but for now, let's get started on the places in the Nine Hells. So with the origin stories of the Nine Hells out of the way, it's time to take an adventure through each layer, my dudes. We'll start at the very top, but just a heads up, there's a crap load of lore and areas in each layer that I'll leave out due to the length of the video, probably extending a bit too long. But I'll cover the very basics of each layer. Hopefully I give you guys a pretty good detail of each one, but without further ado, let's descend into the Nine Hells. Now this layer is called Avernus. The word Avernus almost sounds similar to the word furnace, and that's basically a gist of this place. Fire and lava everywhere, barren scorched hills, rivers of blood, barren mountain ranges, and swarms upon swarms of endless devils and imps roaming the landscape. This is literally hell in Dungeons & Dragons anyways. Even scaling the mountains of this place is not recommended due to the obsidian quartz and other types of crystals sticking out from the ground all over the place. It would easily cut your clothes and open your skin, but this isn't even the worst part. We're far, far from that. A lot of the rocks and boulders you'd find here would resemble tormented faces and shapes of horrifying creatures, with rubble covering the vast plains of Avernus as well. There's bubbling tar pits all over, and quicksand that would literally suck you inside, and lakes of lava everywhere, with salt flats made from the tears of those damned to this literal hell. This isn't meant to be a pleasant place at all. If you were to look up while there, you'd find fireballs racing across the sky of Avernus too, sometimes falling to the ground, leaving burned corpses and screaming sounds afterwards. Anyone who would be crazy enough to travel here would need to find shelter as soon as they arrived, lest these individuals be struck from such things. The air around here is normally filled with pumice and ash, and usually has swarms of flies and insectoids inside of them. There's no sun here, and no moon. The only light that comes from outside of the magma is the blood-red light that suffuses the air like a glowing aura. Now guys, the entire dimension is basically coated in blood as well, due to the millions of battles that consistently take place here in Hell. There's a river of blood that runs through Avernus, called the River Styx, and it's collecting blood from every gulch, stream, and pool from the victims of what goes on here. Obviously, this is where most of the battles for the Blood War take place, but we'll have to cover the Blood War in a future episode, because we still need to talk more about this place before we go into the other 8 layers below. Just understand that this same river runs through each layer and plane of the Nine Hells freely, falling through each individual layer. Now, of all the layers of the Nine Hells, Avernus is the most frequently visited, due to Asmodeus forbidding anyone to open up a portal to the other layers. This means that in order to reach the other layers, you would have to come through Avernus first, basically like the airport, where you need to go through the security part first before you'd be allowed further in. And the reason Asmodeus made it like this is primarily because of the demons who come from the abyss. The Blood War is fought over all of this anyway, my dudes. So essentially, he made it to where those same invading demons would have to conquer Avernus before they'd even be able to make it further into the Nine Hells. Anyways, the big king of this layer is given the title of Lord of the First, and all of the layers below Avernus would hold a higher power. So in a sense, this was the lowest form of nobility for the Nine Hells in terms of overall power. So here's a pretty detailed map of Avernus. At the top left, you have Tiamat's lair, which in a sense is a divine realm that basically is considered to be the prison of Tiamat in the Great Wheel cosmology, which we're going to stick to anyways. That story is a little bit too deep for this episode, so we're gonna have to put it to the side for a later time. For now, let's move on. See that big river running through the main part of the Hells there? Yeah, that's the river Styx, and no guys, that's not lava, that's a river of blood. Now when it comes to Avernus, I have to quote Baldur's Gate 3 here, so skip ahead a little if you guys don't want any spoilers, just a heads up. Now, at the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3, you're literally waking up in a Mind Flayer pod inside of the Great Lair of Avernus. One thing a lot of people don't recognize is the fireballs and warfare going on in the background during that cinematic. That, my dudes, is the Blood War, and I gotta say they did a great job making Avernus look the way it did. For obvious reasons, they didn't add in the notable locations during this cinematic due to there being so much to go over, but it certainly did it justice in my opinion. Doing hell justice. Anyways, you could also find the House of Hope on this layer, if you happen to know a certain Raphael or son of Mephistopheles. Regardless, let's dive down, my dudes, because it's time to go to the second layer of hell. Well guys, we're now deeper on the second layer of Baator, and from here, we need to talk about the potentially infinite city. Crazy, right? A city that possibly goes on forever? Anyways, this layer is entirely covered by a city, almost, which happens to be called Dis. This gigantic place is circled by a ring of spiked mountains, and as far as most adventurers or visitors to this place were concerned, the layer of Dis and the city itself were the same thing. Now this place is massive, but still not as large as the layer of Avernus above it. So you're probably thinking, well, what's this place like? Tell us already. And I will in a second. But as for this layer, it's still very, very hot. The entire city is made of red-hot iron. Every wall and brick and cobblestone would burn you just by touching it. That same material the city is made out of would create a column of smoke that kept the entire city shrouded in a layer of dark haze. Now, this place is a little more civilized than Avernus, if hell could be considered civilized at all. The streets of Dis here were always crowded by parading devil nobles and workers. Now, most of the inhabitants you'd find here would be Abishai, imps, lemurs, Nuperibos, and even Spinagons. But there were also occasionally other planar creatures like shades that could be found here too. Now, the dungeons of this city would usually have petitioners and Blood War prisoners, but they also had kidnapped mortals from the prime material plane of Toril. If you somehow ended up in a campaign that brought you here, you'd be able to hear the tortured screams from the vents inside of the city walls. One of the more notable locations here that a lot of people would notice is the Iron Tower, and that's the personal fortress of Baator, Lord of the Second. This tower is visible from anywhere on the entire second layer of hell due to its enormous size, and it even rises above the haze of the city. For the Horn Dogs, there's the Garden of Delights here, which is like a facility that offers the illusion of sumptuous meals and pleasures of the flesh for extremely gigantic fees. Now, if you're trying to get to this city, my dudes, it would feel like a break from reality. You'd only be able to arrive to the city by following a road paved with literal skulls. The crazy part was that if you approached the city from a distance, you wouldn't even notice yourself actually entering it. you'd just suddenly be inside of the city with no edge or outer wall in sight. Freaky, right? There's no transition between that road and the city. You just suddenly appear inside of it. Anyways, the outsides of the city aren't very well known at all. So let's follow the river Styx and open another portal again, guys, because this same river flows through each layer. From here, things might cool off a little bit, because we're about to descend deeper into the next layer, Minauros. Okay guys, we're now at the third layer of the 9 hells, and we still have 6 more to go after this. But we're taking a pit stop here at the third layer, and the first thing you're gonna notice is that rancid smell. This place is also known by another name, the Stinking Mire. This is the layer of the greed and the avaricious. It is a wretched fen of toxic influence that promised only sickness and despair, slowly pulling everything down into the putrid and toxic mud. This place is probably best described as a great stinking swamp. It's a fetid marsh of mire, muck, and misery that seemingly extends on further than your imagination. This place smells bad. Think to yourself the worst possible smell that you can imagine, my dudes, and imagine it as worse than even that. Just like the layer of Dis above this place has a fog-like ambience that permeates the air as well, except this one is yellowish and murky. In some of the places here, the infernal heat from the 4th layer would rise up from below, while other areas of this massive swamp dimension would be so cold that the very water, if you'd even call it water, would freeze over. Now, the weather here usually consisted of the bog-like putrid air, but oftentimes it would rain acid as well, considering this layer is just so disgustingly putrid. Again, by Asmodeus' decree, you can't enter this layer unless you find a portal to it from the layer of Dis, as the only accessible layer from the mortal realm was Avernus. So this means that you'd have to travel through each layer of hell like I mentioned earlier. Most of this realm stays sinking into the endless bog, and the biggest city, called the city of Minauros, is called the Sinking City. It's the largest settlement in this layer, and at the center of the city lies the throne room of Mammon, or Mammon, who happens to also be called the Lord of the Third. Mammon is considered to be the richest of the devils due to him being the creator of the soul coins in the 9 hells, which means, yeah, hell has a currency. Soul coins basically is the cash of the 9 hells anyways. But there's other things that individuals would consider currency in the 9 hells too. Now, there's another big city that hangs below the top of this dimension called the Jangling Hider, which is a city suspended by chains from the very bottom of the 2nd layer of Dis. And the Jangling Hider is probably the only place in Minauros that isn't considered always sinking, just due to the fact that this place is suspended far in the sky of Minauros. Now, back on the ground, on the edge of a worn, bubbling swamp here, lies the Labyrinth of Truths, which is a grim fortress, isolated and alone. It's a repository of records, basically run by a horde of lesser devil bureaucrats, and guarded by Barbazu and Narzugons. The Labyrinth of Truths is a pretty big deal, because it's basically like a library with documents compiled over the eons. A lot of it is worthless, but some of the stuff in there is invaluable, holding recordings of extremely powerful magics. Anyways, dudes, with all of this horrid stench and bile out of the way, we gotta talk about some of the beings that live in here. Now, obviously we have the Lord of the Third, Mammon, who actually cared little about this layer and spent most of his time scheming and coming up with new plots and ideas. If Mammon would be upset, he would transform himself into a pit fiend and go hunting across the layer. Some of the more notable dukes that forms Mammon's court here would include the generals Baal, Kakranolas, and Melkon. You also have Folklore, who is Mammon's seneschal, and Gulwa, who happens to be Mammon's consort. These guys lived in bowl-like craters in the higher parts of Minauros' volcanic ridges, keeping their treasures in boulder-covered pits guarded by many of their own devil servants. Okay dudes, devils aside, there's more to them that live in this dimensional plane. A lot of hell stinger scorpions are common here, but there's also rumors abound about mosquito-like insect hives, and there's even a gigantic monster here that even the devils are afraid of, known as the Worm of Minauros. This worm was like a bizarre purple-looking worm-like creature with ivory plates and a crested head resembling the skull of an archdevil. We'll talk about this guy more in the Monsterverse series I plan on making in the far future. But for now, we gotta delve even deeper into this literal hell, guys. We're taking another portal to the next layer below, Phlegethos. Now, it's going to get hot again, guys, because now we're entering the 4th layer. And this time, it's gonna get much hotter than before. Very, very hot. This is the 4th layer, Phlegethos. Now this layer's climate closely resembles that of the elemental plane of fire. It's dominated by a scorching heat that ignites the air itself, creating flames that almost seem alive. And these flames would leap at visitors, but it wouldn't even get close or touch the inhabitants of this realm. This place had fissures in the ground that would spew jets of flame that flow into rivers of liquid fire and lava. It also has a lot of volcanoes that constantly erupt and flow rivers of lava deep into an entire ocean of magma. Now, this place is different in terms of nobility. This is where Fiona and Belial rule together, and their partnership is allowed by Asmodeus. Okay dudes, so this place is actually pretty cool. Get it? Because this is also the layer of the hells where a promotion of a devil would take place, and the ritual done here would actually make that devil temporarily vulnerable to the fires of this layer. Now this layer is not as barren as you might think. This place has a Biramak, which is a city made of obsidian and crystal mixed with volcanic rock that you would normally find inside the caldera of a volcano. Now, the legends of this place was that it was once built on top of a deity that Asmodeus killed once. Probably Zargon, but nobody knows. Now, what we do know is that Biramak does have numerous taverns and places for entertainment. Now, if you're looking for a place less hot here in this layer, you'll probably find the area called the Jealous Heart, known as the divine realm of Inanna from the Untheric pantheon. This is a vast field of crimson dust and rivers of blood. Now, it's not as hot as the rest of this layer, but the passion for war with its visitors and residents was another matter entirely. Okay, so let's go and move ourselves towards the center of this layer. Here, you'll find the Pit of Flame. Now, this place is not just a place of pain and punishment, but also a place of pleasure and purification that blurred the lines between the two very heavily. You see, in the center was a massive lake of boiling filth that jettisoned columns of white flame hundreds and hundreds of feet into the air. You'd think this was some kind of ordinary fire at first glance, dudes, but you would be very, very wrong. This is hellfire, and it's kind of an unspeakable hot energy drawn from the hell itself. Even those immune to fire would be in agonizing and writhing and screaming pain from the torment from fire like this. Now, Ozyluths, with the exception of pit fiends, can actually condemn other devils that broke Baatorial law into this same pit of flame. Devils of all layers consider this the worst form of punishment, guys. So if you ever wanted to scare a devil, let them know that this could be their punishment. But some devils are strange too, because they'd find some kind of ecstasy in this kind of pain. So a few of them might see it as the ultimate form of pleasure. Regardless, the inhabitants of this layer would have you finding hellhounds, imps, and spinagons. There's other planar creatures that make their home here, but this layer is heavily guarded. You see, in the city of Biramak, they hold a reserve of 5,000 Hamachulas under the command of the pit fiend Gazra. And Gazra is stationed here in case the invaders from the Abyss manage to make it this far into the layers of the Nine Hells. We'll go into more detail about this in a future episode when we go over the lore here. For now, just sit back and enjoy the ride, because we gotta take another portal, guys, and we're gonna head down further than most adventurers have ever reached. From here, we're about to visit the 5th layer, Stygia. Now guys, if you're visiting here, I honestly hope you've packed some warm clothes, because for the first time, it's going to get very, very cold. This is the 5th layer of the 9 hells. It's ruled by the archdevil Phlegethos, and this place goes by another interesting name, the Frozen Wastes. Now, this place doesn't fulfill any explicit function, but there is an ocean here, my guys. This untamed expanse was called the Great Sea and is a proving ground. Anyways, the environment here is a cruel cold with endless ice, frigid oceans, and a pit of endless murky seas and unpredictable currents churning with crushing, unimaginably massive ice flows and icebergs. This is a realm where the powers of ice and cold are empowered, while fire and heat are diminished. Even light magic is influenced by this plane of existence, taking on a soft gray radiance. But even here in Stygia, the river Styx still melts some of this ice and flows freely through it, although the river here is nearly just as cold as the area. Surprisingly, this is probably the only place here where you'll find any settlements or areas for R&R because of it being one of the only sources of heat in this dimension. The ice below your feet here could extend up to 3 miles deep. Now, when it comes to the river Styx, it actually winds through some of the oceans here, and it would maintain its integrity along the way, going through it like a winding serpent. This place wasn't just ice, however, guys. A lot of the entire region was also covered in mountainous terrain. Some of these mountains would be connected with long, twisting, rocky canyons and hanging valleys. There is a few volcanic rifts in the mountains called steam trenches. The treacherous alpine and glacial ice made scaling this place without magic extremely difficult, with avalanches and such being very common. Now guys, Stygia is also pretty rich in natural wealth. Surprisingly though, with some of the mountain quarries yielding much of the structural stone that's used throughout the 9 hells, like granite, basalt, marble, and even chalk. You'd also find rubies, beryls, and turquoise gems from some of the seams and veins within the rocky areas. Now dudes, closer towards the center of Stygia, you'll find a vast salt swamp frozen in place. For eons, tiny arctic plants and mosses took root in Stygia's thick ice, sending tendrils deep inside to gather what little nutrients there are. Now, the thickest parts of the swamp would have dangerous beasts and creatures you'd not find anywhere in the mortal realms too, however, due to it being richer in nutrients and other necessities. Just like all the layers above it, there's no sun in Stygia. It's just a gloomy sky filled with smoky black clouds that crackle with lightning all the time. So keep that in mind if you guys are going on an adventure in this place. Now, normally you'd only be able to see up to 180 feet away. There's also a sharp stench of frozen over odor in the air here. Okay, with that out of the way, we gotta talk about how the cold works here, guys. This place isn't just like walking around in negative 20 degrees. This place is supernaturally cold, to a degree that most people would consider almost like liquid hydrogen. If you're scaling the mountains, watch out for some of the white flames that sometimes appear when lightning strikes. Well guys, we're gonna have to move on again, so let's grab another portal and descend further into the literal depths of hell. Okay dudes, you can take off all those warm clothes because it's gonna get a lot warmer again. Because if you look up at the leprous colors of the consistently steaming sky above you, it will be raining down burning droplets below. This is the 6th layer, Malbolge. This place is still considered to be one of the most inhospitable layers of the 9 hells. This is known as the Crushing Lands, or the Crushing. But fun fact, this is also where Asmodeus' daughter lives, called Glazia. She's the ruler and literal princess of the 9 hells. But there's a bit of a twist here. This happens to be the place where devils are found breaking the law would go, and they'd undergo years of torturous punishment under the supervision of Glazia as well. Now, back to the surface, this is basically the realm of endless rock avalanches and loud ones too. Now, this place does have a ground layer from the mountainous terrain, but on that ground you would find jagged shards of obsidian that are called the Knives, which are basically towering monoliths that leant against each other to form passages or jutted out in great sheets. Now, if you tried walking across these, you'd think they'd be stable enough to traverse, but many times has the rare adventurer tried this and it would give out, making the poor individual fall down further into the razor-lined pits and end up sliced to pieces and cleaved open. So, this place is probably best described as a seemingly endless slope, as if it were on the side of a mountain. Most of the inhabitants of this layer live in caves or crumbling fortresses, and usually won't wander around outside for very good reason. You know, being crushed by an avalanche of boulders doesn't sound very pleasing. As you probably have guessed, this entire layer is slightly tilted to the side, and it's one of the main reasons half of the chaos here consistently happens. If you're on a campaign traversing this layer, there's a 1 in 5 chance every 10 minutes a boulder will crush through somewhere, and every hour there's a similar chance for a rock slide. Obviously, the frequency of the boulders would kind of be of an indicator as to when the rock slides will occur. According to the lore of this place, it used to be filled with old bronze fortresses once upon a time. Now, there's another notable place in this location called the Hag Countess's Stronghold, which is kind of an interesting place. It's an unnamed citadel, but once upon a time, there were rulers before Glazia, and one of them happened to be known as the Hag Countess, and we'll definitely be covering that in a future video. Regardless, this fortress was the core of a mountain-sized boulder that perpetually rolled down Malbolge's slope on a path unknown to nearly anyone. Now, this place was weird, because you'd think eventually it would roll off the realm, right? Nope, the rules of physics don't work here, my dudes, and the boulders seem to roll on indefinitely, almost as if repeating themselves after reaching the edge of the dimension. Now, this rolling fortress houses a coven of 3 different night hags, some anuses, green hags, and even medusas at all times, even housing a stable full of nightmares. Alright, so back in Malbolge, the second most notable place here is obviously Glazia's Citadel, which is supported by sturdy but seemingly cracked and unstable pillars and buttresses. Now, beneath this place was a labyrinth lined with cells and torture chambers, where those who displeased Glazia were chained up and tormented. There's a bunch of other crazy adventures to be found in this layer, by the way, my dudes, but we'll have to cover them all later in a future video. Regardless, this layer is so freakishly inhospitable that even most devils will actively avoid visiting this place. But we need to move on because we gotta delve further down from here. Welcome guys to Maladomini. This place happens to be where the politics of the Nine Hells takes place. This place is ruled and watched over by the Archdevil Baalzebul, also known as Lord of the Flies. Now, if you're a druid, this layer is your absolute worst nightmare. This is a dimension of black ichor, shuddering and dying life energy, and decay would go on here. It's a scarred urban wasteland dominated by teetering heaps of trash, land absolutely depleted of any plant life, and scattered ruins and hollow fortresses. There's dead cities that dot the entire layer, dudes, and there's also endless slag heaps that are everywhere across this plane. There are mines here, however, and they go on so deep that they honeycomb all over Maladomini, like literal ant tunnels. Deep underground in these extreme tunnels, you'll eventually find the document storehouses of hell, where all the politics and books, paperworks, and the like are stored here. Odds are that there are some extraordinarily overpowered magics hidden within. Regardless, guys, there's also rivers of lava across this plane, and these have great arched bridges engraved with devilish faces across them, and canals and stone-walled aqueducts carrying the magma to the castles that exist here to form molten moats. These same canals are still polluted and clogged, spilling a kind of nasty, horrid effluvium across the entire plain. The sky here has a shade of bluish-black blood in color, and the sludge-ridden seams here basically rust away metals in a heartbeat, as well as it due to being so disgustingly polluted. Now, there's one place of peace here actually, my guys, and it's called Grenpoli, which is the city of diplomacy. Here in this city, weapons and all types of aggression are forbidden. This is where you'd find the political school of the Nine Hells, which would offer courses on deceit and treachery to enterprising devils. Honestly, it's just a normal school of politics. Just kidding. Now for the tidbits of lore. Now, this place in particular has a lot when it's including Asmodeus. Eons ago, like eons and eons ago, this place was supposedly filled with beautiful, bustling cities and magnificent gardens. According to some of the origin stories on the Nine Hells, it was like this before Asmodeus took over the realm after his fall. There's a crazy story to be included here with Beelzebub and Asmodeus in particular, but in the timeline, we're not quite there yet, so we do need to move on. Regardless, we need to move down another layer, guys, because it's time to enter the last 2 layers of the Nine Hells, and this next one is a doozy. Guys, strap on some really warm clothes this time, because this is where the cold gets to the most extreme in the Nine Hells. This is the 8th layer, Cania. Now, Cania is similar to Stygia in terms of cold, and it's filled with mountains and constantly colliding icebergs that drift faster than a person could run. However, this place is far worse than Stygia in terms of its supernatural cold. Normally, it would reach temperatures of -60 degrees Fahrenheit and around -51 degrees Celsius. So the chill here would be almost instant frostbite for individuals not properly prepared to venture through the second to last of the Nine Hells. And like I said previously in this video, this place has a lot of pre-Elder Days lore that still is yet to be uncovered, as they've found angels frozen in the ice here, battling spined creatures of unknown origins. The cold here could be compared to the Frost Veil, which we'll cover in a later video too. This kind of cold would penetrate regular non-magical clothing instantly, freezing to death the individual inside of them. And even those wearing gear designed to withstand cold would find themselves freezing to death within a couple of hours here. Oftentimes, you'd find perfectly preserved corpses to uncover after the glaciers would collide with each other. And sometimes, you'd catch glimpses of entire alien civilizations and cities frozen deep within the ice. There's plenty of isolated citadels here too, filled to the brim with libraries, scattered laboratories, and similar things that dot the landscape of this freezing hell. Now, this layer is governed and ruled by the archdevil Mephistopheles, the Lord of the Eighth. His rule consisted of overseeing endless experiments with arcane magic and understanding the nature of the planes. Many of these experiments were conducted throughout the wastes of the entire layer of this plane. Now, most of the duties here were fulfilled by Hutagen, which allowed Mephisto, or Mephistopheles, to focus more time on his experiments. Now, outside all of the ruins and ancient cities buried unfathomably deep within the ice, there's 2 notable locations here. One is Mephistar. Now, this place is the home of Mephistopheles, and it's a heated citadel that's carved out of the ice and located atop the giant glacier of Nargus, which will only move where Mephisto wants it to. Now, the second location happens to be where we need to go from here, and it's called the Pit, and it's a dark and windy shaft several hundred feet in diameter that's guarded by ice devils and ends in a lake of frozen slush. Here, at the bottom of the lake, almost 2,000 feet underwater, is a portal that will allow us to access the final layer of the Nine Hells. And I hope you're all ready for this last level, because it's probably the wildest one of them all. Now, before we dive in, I need to iterate how insanely uninhospitable Cania is, because most other devils will do their utmost to avoid this place. Most of the inhabitants of Cania are Gelugons, and it's quite unknown what their activities here are, as nigh barely most souls or individuals ever even reach this level of the hells. Regardless, let's enter the pit and cast ourselves a globe of invulnerability as we suffer some extreme cold and enter the final portal below. If you've managed to get this far, congratulations. It's probably because the ruler of this level deemed it so. Either way, this is the final level of the 9 hells. This is Nessus. Now, as you enter this, odds are a Gelugon guard will be quite surprised to see a living mortal this deep, and they're going to attack you on sight regardless of who you are or your disposition. Now, if you get through this part, you'll notice instantly that this entire layer is a gargantuan wasteland filled with nothing but a featureless plain and jagged edges that seem to extend forever. 2,500 miles from east to west, 1,100 miles from north to south, just floating in an endless red void. You'll see fiery storm winds ravaging the plains of this layer, and notice a gargantuan city right where the portal of Mephisto's lair is. This is Malbolge, and it just happens to be the largest city in all of the Outer Plains. And yes, I said the Outer Plains. This is a massive city, filled with millions of devil inhabitants held in reserve for an unknown cataclysmic battle. Either way, at the bottom of the rift is another gigantic and massive citadel, which is Asmodeus' fortress. Asmodeus rules this level, and since it's the final level, that means he's the big cheese of the 9 hells. This guy is the Satan of the Dungeons & Dragons universe. He also has a plethora of greater devils that work for him on this level too. Now here's a fun fact. Later on in the timeline, Zariel once fell into the hells too, and Asmodeus allowed her to recover on this layer before assigning her as the Duchess of Avernus. Anyways, on this layer, you'll find legions upon legions of Amnizus, pit fiends, and Cornigons living among others in these barren plains. Otherwise, we can only delve slightly further below into the deepest trench of the hells, known as the Serpent's Coil. Here, you will find the remnants of Asmodeus' original fall into the hells, and his true form, which nearly all of the gods themselves don't even know about. Asmodeus is an absolute mastermind of planning after all. Either way, the blood shed from his true form here consistently sprouts new devils, which would be perfect specimens of pit fiends and Cornigons. It is here in the Serpent's Coil that Asmodeus is recovering, and he's been recovering in his true form even to the current era of modern D&D. Now, with all of that stuff aside, above the ground you'll find Tabjari, which is another citadel made of copper that stands along the walls of the Reaper's Canyon. This place contains a special copy of the Pact Primeval, which is a cosmic document that was signed eons and eons ago to allow Asmodeus as the cosmic jail warden of the 9 hells. And guys, that's about it from here. I understand that there's a ton of more things and stuff to include in these hells, but I can't exactly cover them all in a single video. Thankfully, I do plan on doing it over time. I honestly hope you guys enjoyed this adventure I set out to accomplish with video editing, because this is the longest video I've ever made as of yet. And this took forever to make. I'm not joking, this took a very long time for me. Either way, guys, I'll be including parts of the video allowing you to skip through segments and the like if you're curious in the future, and if you see things I got wrong, as always, please do not hesitate to call me out on it. I'm far from a perfect human being, and I guarantee there's at least 1 or 2 things wrong in this video. So that kind of concludes the 9 hells, my dudes. If you continue riding the upper, the river Styx down from here, you'll end up in another of the outer realms, which is different from the 9 hells. and I'll definitely be covering that in a future video. But that's about it, and as always, guys, this is Grimdoc the Lore Master, signing out.